You people always come in here with stories and expect us to drop everything, Officer Ryan Cole said, his voice flat, practiced, already done with her before she had even finished speaking, and the sound of his words seemed to hang in the precinct lobby longer than it should have, like something heavier than air, something that made the fluorescent lights above flicker just a little colder as a few heads turned and then quickly turned away again, because no one wanted to be caught staring. No one wanted to be involved. Not in this, not again, not with someone like her. Mrs. Lillian Hayes stood on the other side of the counter, small but unshaken, her coat worn thin at the elbows, her hands resting gently on a stack of neatly folded papers as if they mattered, as if they still held weight in a room that had already decided they didn't, and for a moment she didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. She just looked at him, really looked at him, the way someone looks at a photograph they've seen too many times, memorizing every line, every shadow, every detail that refuses to change. Ryan barely noticed, or maybe he chose not to, his attention already drifting to the glowing screen behind him, to the radio chatter crackling faintly from somewhere deeper in the station, to anything that felt more urgent than an elderly woman asking for time he didn't think she deserved, and with a small, dismissive motion of his hand, he pushed the papers back toward her, not roughly, not violently, just enough for them to slide an inch across the smooth surface of the counter, just enough to say, without saying, that this was over. The papers shifted, edges misaligned now, a quiet disruption that seemed louder than it should have been, and Lillian's fingers tightened just slightly as she steadied them, her thumb pressing down on the top page where a name was printed in bold, a name that Ryan hadn't read, hadn't even glanced at, because to him it was just another report, another claim, another story that would lead nowhere. A young officer by the doorway shifted his weight, watching, unsure, while a civilian waiting on a bench lowered his eyes to his phone, the soft tap of his screen the only sound breaking the stillness that had settled in like dust. Lillian finally drew in a breath, slow and measured, and when she spoke her voice was quiet, steady, carrying not across the room but directly toward him, as if it didn't need volume to be heard. "I'm not asking you to believe me," she said, her words landing gently but firmly. "I'm asking you to look." And for the briefest second, something in Ryan's posture paused, not enough for anyone else to notice, just a fraction of a second where his hand hovered above the keyboard, suspended between dismissal and something else he didn't have a name for. But then it passed, replaced by the same hardened routine that had carried him through years of decisions like this, and he let out a quiet breath through his nose, almost a laugh, but not quite, shaking his head as if to reset the moment back to something simpler, something easier, something he could control. "Ma'am," he said again, softer now, but no less. "Final, we can't open a case every time someone walks in with a story." And the word story lingered, stretched thin between them, as Lillian's eyes lowered briefly to the papers in her hands before lifting again, not in defiance, not in anger, but in something far more unsettling, something patient, something that didn't leave when it was told to, and somewhere beyond the glass doors of the precinct. The late afternoon light dimmed behind a gathering line of clouds, the reflection of it, catching faintly in the polished floor, turning the space colder without anyone saying a word. The papers remained in her hands, but they were no longer just papers to her. They were something she had carried across bus stops and quiet mornings and long afternoons where no one had listened. And as the room settled back into its routine hum, Lillian Hayes gently straightened the stack, aligning each edge with a precision that spoke of habit, not hesitation, as if order was the one thing she could still control. And for a moment she said nothing, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel intentional rather than empty. Ryan Cole had already turned slightly in his chair, one hand resting near the keyboard, the other brushing against a half-empty coffee cup gone cold hours ago, his attention drifting between the screen and the low murmur of voices behind him. But something about the way she did not leave lingered at the edge of his awareness, subtle, persistent, like a sound you cannot quite locate, but cannot ignore either. Lillian's gaze moved briefly across the room, not searching for sympathy, not expecting help, just observing, the way someone does when they have spent years being overlooked, memorizing details that others dismiss, the scuffed tile near the entrance, the flicker in the overhead light, The faint reflection of her own silhouette in the glass door where the sky had grown dimmer, the clouds now heavier, pressing low against the late afternoon. She drew a slow breath and lifted the top sheet from the stack, her fingers steady despite the slight tremor that came with age. And she placed it back down in front of him, not pushing it this time, not forcing it into his space, just setting it there, quietly, deliberately. "It is not a story," she said, her voice even, measured, carrying the weight of something lived rather than imagined. "It is a record," and the words settled differently, sharper, more grounded, as if it belonged in this room whether he accepted it or not. Ryan exhaled through his nose again, a habit now, a reflex to close the door on conversations he did not want to have, and he tapped a key without looking at the page, the soft click echoing faintly. "Ma'am, we have procedures," he replied, the tone rehearsed, the kind that had ended countless conversations before this one. "If there is no active incident, there is nothing to process." And still he did not look at the name printed in bold at the top, did not see the date, did not notice the small, careful handwriting in the margins where notes had been added over time. Lillian nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if she had heard those words before. In different voices, different rooms, all carrying the same conclusion, and she adjusted her grip on the papers again, her thumb resting over the edge as though holding them in place against something unseen. "There was an incident," she said softly, and this time her eyes did not leave his. "You were there." And the sentence did not rise, did not accuse. It simply existed between them, quiet and immovable. Ryan's fingers paused for the briefest moment above the keyboard, the motion so small it could have been missed, and somewhere behind him a radio crackled with a call that no one immediately answered, the sound stretching thin across the room before fading back into static, and he let out a short breath, shaking his head again, more firmly now, as if to clear something he did not want to consider. "I think you are mistaken," he said, finally glancing up, but only for a second, just enough to meet her eyes and then look away again, dismissing the connection as quickly as it formed, because to acknowledge it would mean stepping into something uncertain, something that did not fit the clean lines of his routine. Lillian did not move, did not argue, did not raise her voice. She simply reached into her coat pocket with slow, careful precision and withdrew a small, folded photograph, its edges worn, its surface softened by time, and she placed it gently on top of the papers, aligning it with the same quiet care, and though Ryan did not look at it yet, the presence of it shifted the air in a way that even the room seemed to notice, the low conversations dimming, the weight of something unspoken settling just beneath the surface, waiting. Ryan Cole did not touch the photograph at first, but he saw it, even without meaning to, the way the corner of it caught the overhead light, the way its worn edges contrasted against the clean, white paper beneath it, and something about that small detail unsettled him more than the words she had spoken, because objects like that did not belong to stories, they belonged to memory, to proof, to something that did not fade just because it was inconvenient. He shifted slightly in his chair, his jaw tightening as he tried to keep his focus on the screen in front of him. But the letters blurred for a second longer than they should have, and the low hum of the precinct seemed to recede, replaced by a quiet that pressed in from the edges of the room, subtle but unmistakable. Lillian Hayes did not rush him, did not fill the silence with explanation. She simply stood there, her posture steady, her hands now resting lightly on the counter beside the papers, as if she had already done everything she needed to do and the rest was no longer in her control, and that stillness carried a kind of weight that words could not match. Ryan finally exhaled, a little sharper this time, and reached forward with 2 fingers, sliding the photograph, just enough to bring it fully into view, not lifting it yet, not committing to it, just acknowledging its presence. And what he saw made him pause, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to react, but inside, something shifted, a small fracture in the certainty he had been holding on to. The image was faded but clear enough, a younger man standing beside a patrol car, his uniform slightly wrinkled, his expression calm, not posing, just present, the kind of photo taken without ceremony, and beside him, just at the edge of the frame, was a second figure, partially cut off, but familiar in a way that Ryan could not immediately place, not because he had never seen it, but because he had not expected to see it here, now, in this moment. His fingers hovered over the photograph, and for a brief second, the memory tried to surface, not fully formed, just fragments, a late night, flashing lights reflecting off glass, the sound of his own breath too loud in his ears, and a voice, steady, guiding. But he pushed it down before it could take shape, straightening slightly as if the act itself could restore order. "Ma'am," he said again. But this time the word carried less certainty, less distance, as though something had shifted in the space between them without his permission. "I do not know what you think this proves." And even as he spoke, his eyes flicked back to the photograph, drawn to it in a way he could not fully control. Lillian watched him quietly, her expression unchanged, but there was something in her gaze now, not expectation, not hope, just a quiet acknowledgement that he was closer than he had been before, whether he realized it or not. And she moved one hand slightly, not to take the photograph back, not to push it forward, just enough to rest her fingers beside it, grounding it there, anchoring it in the moment. "Turn it over," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried across the counter with a clarity that cut through the noise, and Ryan hesitated, his hand still hovering, the room around him continuing as if nothing had changed, officers moving, phones ringing, papers shuffling. Yet for him, everything had narrowed to that single object and the choice in front of him, a simple motion that somehow felt heavier than it should, and after a second that stretched just a little too long, he reached out, lifted the photograph between his fingers, and turned it over. The back of the photograph was not blank, and the moment it turned in Ryan Cole's hand, the air seemed to tighten, as if the room itself had drawn a quiet breath and decided to hold it. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, slightly faded but still clear, ink pressed into paper with intention rather than haste. And for a second Ryan did not read it, not fully, his eyes catching only fragments at first, shapes of letters that felt familiar in a way he could not explain, until they aligned into something undeniable, something that refused to stay distant. His thumb shifted slightly along the edge, steadying the photograph as the words came into focus, and his posture changed without him realizing it. Shoulders no longer squared in authority, but subtly lowered, as though something invisible had been placed there. The noise of the precinct continued, a phone ringing somewhere behind him, footsteps crossing tile, a muted conversation near the doorway, but all of it felt farther away. Now, dimmed, like sound heard through glass, because the words in his hand carried a weight that did not belong to routine. He swallowed once, quietly, and read again, slower this time. The name written beneath the message anchoring everything in place. Marcus Hayes. And something inside him shifted more sharply now. Not a memory fully formed, but a recognition. A connection that had been buried under years of distance and repetition. And the fragments returned, not as a single clear image, but as pieces, the glow of emergency lights reflecting off wet pavement, the metallic scent of rain in the air, his own heartbeat louder than anything else, and a voice cutting through it, calm, steady, guiding him when everything else had blurred. His fingers tightened slightly around the photograph, not enough to crease it, just enough to hold on to it, as if it might slip away if he did not. And for the first time since she had walked in, he did not immediately respond, did not reach for procedure or protocol to shield himself from what was unfolding. Lillian Hayes watched him in silence, her expression unchanged, but there was a stillness in her presence that felt intentional, as though she had already walked this path many times and knew exactly where it led, even if he did not yet see it. Ryan lifted his eyes from the photograph, just slightly, not fully meeting hers, but no longer avoiding the connection either, and his voice, when it came, was quieter, less certain, stripped of the sharp edges it had carried before. This was taken years ago," he said, though the statement felt incomplete even as he spoke it, as if it was only the surface of something deeper he had not yet allowed himself to confront. Lillian nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the truth in his words without adding to them, and she moved her hand just enough to rest her fingertips lightly against the edge of the counter, grounding herself in the moment. 10 years, she said, her voice soft but unwavering, and the number seemed to settle between them with a weight that stretched beyond time, beyond distance, into something far more personal. Ryan exhaled, a shallow breath that did not quite release the tension building in his chest, and his gaze dropped back to the photograph, to the name, to the handwriting that now felt impossible to dismiss, because it was no longer just ink on paper. It was a bridge to something he had almost forgotten, something that did not fit into the clean structure of his present, and the realization came slowly, not as a sudden shock, but as a quiet, undeniable shift, like a door opening just enough to let light through, revealing what had always been there. He did not speak again right away, did not push the photograph back, did not return to his screen, and in that silence, something changed, subtle but irreversible. The distance he had placed between himself and her beginning to close, not through force, not through argument, but through the simple, undeniable presence of truth resting in his hands. Ryan Cole did not realize how long he had been standing there until the muscles in his hand began to tighten around the photograph, the edges pressing faintly into his fingers as if reminding him that this was not something he could simply set aside and forget. And for the first time since the moment she had walked in, the rhythm of the precinct no longer felt like something he controlled, but something he was standing outside of. Watching from a distance he had not chosen, he lowered the photograph slowly, not returning it to the counter yet, just holding it at chest level as if the act of keeping it close might help him make sense of the fragments forming in his mind, the pieces of a night he had filed away years ago under survival and duty, never expecting them to return in this quiet, unassuming form. "I remember the call," he said finally, his voice low, almost careful, as though speaking too loudly might break whatever fragile connection had begun to form, and even as he spoke, his gaze drifted past her for a moment, unfocused, pulled backward into something he had not revisited in a long time. Late shift, heavy rain, dispatch said it was routine, and the words came slowly, not rehearsed, not structured, just emerging as they found their way forward. Lillian Hayes did not interrupt, did not fill in the gaps. She simply listened, her stillness now carrying a different weight, not just patience but recognition, as if she had been waiting for this moment not because she needed to be heard, but because he needed to remember. Ryan's jaw tightened slightly as more of the memory surfaced, not all at once, but enough to unsettle the certainty he had held onto for years. There was another officer there, he continued, his eyes dropping back to the photograph, to the name that now felt impossible to separate from the image in his mind. He stayed calm, kept talking, told me exactly what to do, and his voice faltered just enough to reveal something beneath it, something that had not been there before, a quiet uncertainty that replaced the authority he usually carried so easily. His thumb brushed lightly over the back of the photograph, over the ink that had survived a decade, and the realization did not come as a sudden impact, but as a slow, undeniable shift, like something aligning into place after being out of order for too long. And when he looked up again, his eyes met Lillian's fully this time, no longer avoiding, no longer dismissing, but searching, as if confirming something he already knew but had not yet said aloud. "Marcus," he said, the name leaving his mouth with a weight that surprised him, heavier than a memory, heavier than a recognition, something closer to truth. And the moment it was spoken, the distance between past and present seemed to collapse into a single point. Lillian nodded once, her expression softening not with relief, but with a quiet acknowledgement that the moment had finally arrived, that the name had found its way back to where it belonged, and she took a small breath, steady, controlled, before speaking. "He wrote that before his last shift," she said, her voice gentle but firm, each word placed with intention. And Ryan felt something in his chest tighten at the simplicity of it, at the way it carried more weight than any explanation could. He glanced down at the photograph again, at the handwriting that now felt personal, immediate, no longer distant or abstract, and for a second, the room around him seemed to fade entirely, replaced by the realization that the man he had remembered only as a voice, a presence in a moment of uncertainty, had been standing in front of him all along through her. Through this quiet persistence he had tried so hard to dismiss. He inhaled slowly, deeper this time, as if grounding himself in something new, something he had not prepared for. And when he finally spoke again, the edge in his voice was gone completely, replaced by something quieter, something human. "Why did you come here today?" he asked, not as a challenge, not as a dismissal, but as a question he genuinely needed answered. And in that shift, subtle but undeniable, the balance between them changed, not through force, not through confrontation, but through the quiet, steady unveiling of something that could no longer be ignored. The question lingered between them longer than either of them expected, not because it was difficult to understand, but because of what it carried beneath it. And Lillian Hayes did not answer right away, not out of hesitation, but out of care, as if the truth deserved the same patience she had shown from the moment she walked in. The lights above buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow across the counter. And outside the glass doors the sky had darkened further, the first thin lines of rain, beginning to trace their way down the surface, slow and steady, blurring the shapes of passing cars into soft streaks of light. Lillian finally drew a breath, her shoulders rising just slightly before settling again. And when she spoke, her voice remained calm, grounded, carrying something deeper than explanation. "Because today is 10 years, she said, and the simplicity of it settled into the space between them with a quiet finality, as though the date itself had weight, as though it had been waiting for this moment just as much as she had. Ryan Cole's grip on the photograph loosened just a fraction, not enough to drop it, but enough to acknowledge the shift inside him, and his eyes flicked briefly toward the window, toward the rain now gathering strength, before returning to her. The connection no longer something he avoided, but something he could not ignore. "Every year," Lillian continued, her gaze steady, not searching for sympathy, not asking for understanding, just stating what had always been true. "I come here, and I ask the same thing." And she paused for a moment, not to build tension, not to emphasize, but simply because the memory itself required space, required breath. "I ask someone to remember him the way I do." And there was no accusation in her words, no bitterness, only a quiet persistence that made them harder to dismiss than any raised voice ever could. Ryan swallowed once, the motion subtle but visible now, his composure no longer as firm as it had been at the start, and he glanced down at the papers on the counter, at the photograph in his hand, at the name that now felt personal in a way he had not prepared for. And for the first time, the procedures he had relied on felt distant, insufficient, like tools designed for a different kind of moment. The rain outside intensified, tapping softly against the glass in an uneven rhythm, and the sound filled the silence that followed, not empty but full, as if the world itself had slowed to match the weight of what was unfolding. Lillian's hands rested lightly against the counter, her fingers relaxed now, no longer gripping the papers as tightly as before, as though the act of being heard, even partially, had eased something she had carried for far too long. And she looked at him again, not as an officer, not as authority, but simply as a man standing in front of her, he believed. "In what this badge meant," she said quietly, her eyes flicking briefly to the insignia on his uniform before returning to his face, even when it did not believe in him. And the words did not accuse, did not challenge, they simply existed, undeniable in their honesty. Ryan felt the weight of them settle somewhere deeper than he expected, not sharp, not overwhelming, but persistent, like a truth that does not need to shout to be heard. And he shifted his stance slightly, the small movement, breaking the stillness just enough to remind him that he was still standing, still present, still capable of choosing what came next. He looked at the photograph again, then at the papers, and then finally back at Lillian, his expression no longer guarded, no longer dismissive, but uncertain in a way that felt new, unfamiliar. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, stripped of the distance he had maintained. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, not as a formality, not as a reflex, but as a genuine question. And in that moment, the balance shifted completely, not through force, not through confrontation, but through the quiet, steady presence of a truth that had finally been allowed to exist. Lillian Hayes did not answer immediately, and for a moment it seemed as though the question itself had shifted something deeper than either of them expected, as if the simple act of asking it had already begun to change the direction of everything that followed. She looked at Ryan Cole not with urgency, not with expectation, but with a quiet steadiness that made the space between them feel smaller, more human. And she let the sound of the rain fill the silence for a few seconds longer, the soft tapping against the glass now steady, rhythmic, almost grounding. Her gaze moved briefly to the photograph still in his hand, then to the badge on his chest, and back to his eyes, as though connecting the past and present in a way that did not need explanation. "I do not need you to fix anything," she said finally, her voice calm, even, carrying a weight that came from years of being unheard and still choosing to speak. "And I am not here to reopen anything that cannot be changed." And the words were gentle, but they settled firmly, removing any illusion that this was about procedure or correction. Ryan's brow tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in concentration, as if he was trying to understand a request that did not fit into any category he had been trained to handle. And he shifted his weight again, the photograph still between his fingers, his posture no longer defensive but uncertain in a way that felt unfamiliar. Lillian continued, her tone unchanged. "I came here because you were there." And she let that sit for a moment, not expanding on it, not explaining further, trusting the truth of it to carry itself. And because sometimes, the people who remember are the only ones who can keep someone from being forgotten. And the simplicity of her words made them heavier, not lighter, as though they had been refined over years into exactly what needed to be said and nothing more. Ryan inhaled slowly, deeper than before, and for the first time, he did not look away, did not retreat into routine or distance. He simply listened, and the act itself felt different, intentional, as though he was no longer standing behind a counter, but within the moment itself. The rain outside grew slightly louder, the sound filling the edges of the room while everything between them remained still, focused, and Lillian's hand moved gently toward the papers, not to take them away, but to rest on them lightly, grounding them in place, grounding herself. "He did his job," she said, her voice soft but steady. "He did it the way he believed it should be done," and there was no pride in her tone, no attempt to elevate or defend, just truth, simple and clear. And after that night, people stopped saying his name. And this time there was a slight pause, not long, just enough to let the weight of that reality settle between them. "Except me." Ryan felt something shift again, not sharp, not overwhelming, but persistent, like a quiet pressure building beneath the surface, and he glanced down at the photograph once more, at the name that now carried more than memory, more than recognition, something closer to responsibility. "You asked what I want," Lillian said, her eyes returning to his, steady, unwavering. "I want you to say his name out loud, here, where it still matters." And the request was so simple it almost felt unexpected, stripped of complexity, stripped of demand, yet it carried more weight than anything he had been prepared for, because it required no authority, no report, no action beyond acknowledgement. And for a moment Ryan did not respond, his lips parting slightly before closing again, as if the act of speaking had become something more deliberate than it had ever been before. And the silence that followed was not empty, but full, filled with the presence of a name waiting to be remembered, waiting to be returned to the world in a place where it had been lost. The silence did not break right away, and in that stillness, the weight of the moment deepened, stretching across the space between them like something unseen but undeniable, as Ryan Cole stood there with the photograph in his hand, his thumb resting lightly against the faded edge while the name echoed quietly in his mind, no longer distant, no longer abstract, but present, waiting. His chest rose slowly with a breath that felt heavier than it should have, and for the first time, the act of speaking felt deliberate, not automatic, not shaped by training or routine, but chosen, and that difference settled into him with a quiet gravity. He glanced once more at the image, at the younger man frozen in time beside the patrol car, and the fragments of memory that had once been scattered now felt closer, clearer, aligning just enough to carry meaning. And when he lifted his gaze back to Lillian Hayes, there was no distance left in it, no barrier of authority, only recognition. His lips parted slightly, then closed again, not out of hesitation, but out of care, as if he understood now that this moment was not about filling silence but about honoring it properly. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, stripped of everything unnecessary. "Marcus Hayes," he said, and the name did not rush out. It did not fade. It settled into the room with a quiet strength that seemed to reach beyond the walls, beyond the present, into something that had been, waiting to be acknowledged. The sound of it lingered, not loud, not dramatic, but complete, and for a moment, even the subtle noise of the precinct seemed to soften, as if the world itself had paused just enough to let it exist. Lillian's eyes did not change immediately, but something within them shifted, a quiet release, not relief, not triumph, but recognition, as if a weight she had carried for years had finally been shared, even if only for a second, and she gave a small nod, not as approval, not as permission, but as acknowledgement that the moment had happened exactly as it needed to. Ryan lowered his gaze briefly, the photograph still in his hand, and exhaled slowly, a breath that carried more than air, something closer to understanding, and he placed the photograph gently back onto the stack of papers, not sliding it away, not distancing himself from it, but setting it down with care, aligning it the way she had earlier, as if mirroring her quiet precision without realizing it. "He saved me that night," he said after a moment, his voice softer now, not for the room, not for anyone else, but for her, for the truth that had finally taken shape between them, and the admission did not come with explanation, did not need to. It existed on its own, complete, undeniable. Lillian listened without interruption, her posture unchanged, her hands resting lightly against the counter, but there was a subtle shift in the way she held herself now. Not lighter, not relieved, but steadier, as though something important had been placed back where it belonged. Ryan lifted his eyes again, meeting hers fully, and for a second, the rain outside grew louder against the glass, the sound filling the edges of the moment while everything between them remained still, focused, real. "I should have remembered sooner," he added quietly, not as an excuse, not as a defense, but as a truth he had just begun to understand, and the words carried no expectation of forgiveness, no request for absolution, only recognition of what had been lost in the years between. Lillian shook her head gently, a small motion that held more meaning than words, and her voice, when it came, remained calm, grounded. "You remembered now," she said, and that was all, no more, no less. And in that simplicity, something shifted again, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but final in a way that did not need to announce itself. Ryan nodded once, slowly, the motion measured, as if acknowledging not just her words but the moment itself. And as he stood there, no longer behind the shield of routine or authority, the balance between them felt different, not equal in status, not defined by roles, but grounded in something quieter, something more enduring, the simple, undeniable act of remembering a name where it had once been forgotten. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm now, no longer tentative, no longer distant, but present in a way that filled the quiet spaces between sounds, tapping softly against the glass doors as if marking time that had already passed, and time that could not be taken back. And inside the precinct, the lights hummed faintly above, casting the same pale glow over everything. Yet nothing felt the same as it had before. Ryan Cole stood still for a moment longer, his hand resting lightly against the counter near the photograph, not touching it again, but not moving away either, as if the space it occupied had become something he needed to remain close to. And his gaze followed Lillian Hayes as she gently gathered her papers, aligning them once more with the same quiet precision she had shown from the beginning, each motion unhurried, deliberate, carrying a calm that did not seek acknowledgement. She did not rush to leave, did not look back immediately. She simply turned slightly, adjusting her coat with one hand while the other held the stack of papers close to her chest, the photograph resting securely on top, no longer needing to be presented, no longer needing to prove anything. Because what needed to be said had already been said. Ryan watched her, not as an officer observing a visitor, but as someone witnessing the closing of a moment that had changed him in ways he could not yet fully understand. And he took a slow breath, deeper than before, grounding himself in the reality of what had just happened, in the simple act of remembering a name that had almost been lost. "Ma'am," he said quietly, the word different now, no longer distant, no longer dismissive, but respectful in a way that felt natural rather than forced. And she paused, just slightly, turning her head enough to acknowledge him without fully facing him, giving him the space to speak if he chose to. Ryan hesitated for a brief second, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood now that words carried weight, and when he spoke again, his voice was steady, measured. I will not forget him again. And the promise was simple, not formal, not written, but it held a sincerity that did not need anything more. Lillian closed her eyes for the briefest moment, not in relief, not an emotion that could be easily named, but an acknowledgement, as though something had settled into place exactly where it belonged. And when she opened them again, she gave a small nod, a gesture that carried acceptance without requiring anything further. She turned then, walking slowly toward the glass doors, her steps even, unhurried, the sound of her shoes against the tiles soft but clear, and as she reached the entrance, the door opened with a quiet shift of air, the sound of rain. Growing louder for a second before settling again as she stepped outside, Ryan remained where he was, his eyes following her through the glass as she moved into the gray afternoon, her figure gradually blending into the rhythm of the rain, becoming part of it, not disappearing, but continuing forward in a way that did not need to be watched to be understood. Behind him, the precinct resumed its normal pace, voices rising and falling, phones ringing, footsteps crossing the floor, but for him, everything felt slightly different, as if a layer had been lifted, revealing something more real beneath the routine. His gaze dropped briefly to the counter, to the space where the photograph had been, now empty, yet not empty at all, because the absence itself carried meaning, carried memory, carried the quiet imprint of something that would not be dismissed again. He straightened slowly, his shoulders settling into a posture that no longer felt like authority alone, but responsibility, and, for a moment, he simply stood there, listening to the rain, to the hum of the lights, to the quiet echo of a name that now lived not just in memory, but in him, steady and unspoken, a reminder that did not need to be heard aloud to be understood. And in that stillness, there was no need for more words, because the silence itself carried everything that mattered.